In 1943, in Frontenay, Rouen, a small village in France, a house became the scene of some bizarre paranormal activity that seemed to defy any natural explanation. The events were so strange that even the gendarmes were called, which are the French police, with several of them reporting the unexplained things that they saw in the little house. I'm Bleaki, and today I'll tell you about the haunting of Frontenay, a terrifying case surrounding a teenage girl called Geneviève, who was terrorised by a ghost who proved itself not only to be intelligent, but was hell-bent on hurting her and her elderly grandparents. Things got so bad that the police and a priest were called in, but they failed to remove the evil entity. But that's when a paranormal investigator with 20 years of experience heard about the case and offered his help. Captain Zayn was known for his skepticism and level-headed approach to such cases, but after visiting the house, what he found was beyond anything he'd ever experienced, especially when it came to the level of raw paranormal violence. This case began with Mr. Henry Orcher, his wife Alexandrine, and their 15-year-old granddaughter Geneviève, who lived in a small house near the national road of Frontenay, Rouen, a village with only 1,200 residents. The house which they rented was simple. One large room on the ground floor served as both the dining room and the bedroom, and there were 2 additional floors, each with one room, a bedroom on the first floor and an attic on the second. The house lacked modern amenities such as a bathroom or toilet, a typical feature in French houses in the 1940s. No toilet. I wouldn't want to be the estate agent trying to sell that house. There's no way I could convince somebody that this sink has a built-in bidet. While the family lived a peaceful life in their modest home at first, that all changed on November 22nd, 1943, when Mrs. Orcher, who was 77, was sitting at a bedside table. She was watching her granddaughter Geneviève mess around with a doll on the floor, when suddenly a chair was launched across the room by an invisible force, but suddenly slowed down and landed at her feet. Startled, Mrs. Orcher screamed and told her granddaughter to come to her, confused about what was happening. At that moment, the clock struck 6:30 p.m, and Mrs. Orcher convinced herself that the chair must have just fallen and her mind had played a trick on her. But that proved not to be the case, as soon after, the house came alive. The 2 women went to bed around 9 p.m, but shortly afterward they heard scratching noises coming from Genevieve's bed. While this was unsettling to both of them, it wasn't the first time that Mrs. Orcher had heard the sound, as back in May of that year she heard the same scratching noise in the room when she was all alone. Mrs. Orcher felt a sense of dread engulf her, like a premonition that something terrifying was about to happen. As she feared, the 2 women sat up in fear as they felt the bed begin to tremor before being dragged across the floor. Suddenly, the long bolster cushion folded over the elderly woman's face while the sheets were yanked off her. Sounds like my partner on a cold night. After that, the entire room seemed to come alive. Curtain rods fell, objects toppled off shelves, and furniture began to move all at once, with items moving around like a feng shui master after drinking too much coffee. At around 10 p.m, Mrs. Orcher grabbed hold of Genevieve's hand and rushed out of the house to find her husband, who worked as a night watchman at a fodder press. When Mr. Orcher arrived at the house, the normally tidy room was in complete disarray. As he stood there, frustrated, the coal stove began to move on its own, scraping across the floor before flipping over. Plates then jumped off the stove, shattering on the floor. With the women screaming and Mr. Orcher frozen in disbelief, the activity suddenly stopped, and everything went silent. Mr. Orcher calmed down, attempting to make sense of the situation, and told his granddaughter to go back to bed. But before Geneviève could lie down, the blankets suddenly wrapped themselves around her like a cocoon before violently dragging her off the bed and onto the floor. After struggling with the force keeping her trapped within the sheets, the pressure was suddenly relieved, and the girl was left breathing heavily and petrified on the bedroom floor. After that incident, the rest of the night continued without any activity, with an atmosphere he could cut with a knife. The next morning, the disturbances seemingly carried on. Mr. Orcher's coat inexplicably lifted off the floor, travelled across the room, and fell by the bed. Mrs. Orcher also experienced strange phenomena, such as the sheets of her bed stretching as though an invisible force was trying to pin her down, similar to what happened to Geneviève. While this was happening, the curtains stretched unnaturally, becoming rigid like wood. Feeling trapped, a wave of terror overtook Mrs. Orcher, but moments later the curtains returned to their usual state, and whatever was on top of her appeared to let her go. The strange occurrences continued, with objects moving on their own, and a marble tablet falling from the bedside table and breaking on the floor. Alarmed by the screams and the banging going on inside the house, some neighbours gathered outside, prompting Mr. Billen, a local gendarme, to investigate, fearing that a crime was taking place. After entering, he found the house in disarray, and upon hearing the family's account, he remained sceptical but agreed to examine the premises. He couldn't find any strings attached to anything and believed that the family was genuinely scared but may have been victims of hysteria. Just as he was preparing to leave, however, a metal box flew off a table and landed near his feet, something he couldn't explain. At that moment, Billen began to take the situation more seriously. He decided to have one more search and heard scratching sounds coming from Genevieve's bed. He quickly searched for any rats or mice, but nothing was there. Unsure of what to do next and uncertain about what to make of it all, he reported the strange happenings to his superior. Can you imagine how awkward it must have been to present an e-fit of Casper the Friendly Ghost to your boss? Mr. and Mrs. Orcher, who started to believe that they were cursed, reached out to the local parish priest after the disturbances in their home became too much to bear. The priest was initially sceptical, dismissing the event as mere superstition, but he agreed to investigate after the couple wouldn't take no for an answer. Upon arriving at the house, the priest found the atmosphere heavy with an eerie sense of unease. Though at first he didn't witness anything supernatural, he did notice that the large clock in the main room had stopped, which he thought was most likely natural. But what made it strange, however, was that the hands were frozen at a specific time, and despite the priest's attempts, he couldn't get it to restart, which unsettled him, as he had learnt about the occult connections to clocks and how this was a spirit's way of affecting time so that they could manifest. As he continued looking around the house, the priest began to feel a strange sense of foreboding, just like what Mrs. Orcher felt. He felt like something was about to happen. He eventually told himself that he was letting the fear of others affect him and was about to leave, but that's when a chair from the dining table suddenly shot backwards and struck him sharply in the leg. The priest recalled in shock, his mind racing to rationalise the event, but before he could react, a series of loud deliberate knocks echoed through the room, as though something unseen was trying to make its presence known to the religious man. The sounds were so unnerving that the priest momentarily hesitated, with the shocked faces of the Orcher family staring at him helplessly. While the priest tried to put himself together and do something, a large painting which had hung undisturbed on the wall for years suddenly detached itself and crashed violently to the ground, the glass shattering all across the floor. At this point, the priest, visibly shaken, quickly recited a prayer for protection, though it was unclear whether it had any immediate effect. He advised Mr. and Mrs. Orcher to report the activity to the local authorities, which is a really strange order, as cases of the paranormal and dealing with evil spirits were usually handled by the church privately. You know things are bad when the ones in charge of giving ghosts the boot try and pass it on to someone else. The priest, having witnessed more than he was willing to accept, left the house in a hurry and remarkably never returned to the Orcher family home again. His abrupt departure only added to the couple's sense of isolation and fear, and they were left to contend with an increasingly violent spirit, with no one else able to help them. By November 24th, with the ghostly activity seemingly escalating, Mr. Orcher went to the police station to report that his granddaughter could no longer sit still without being thrown from her chair by an invisible force. 2 officers, including Mr. Billen, went back to the house to investigate. The skepticism of Constable Maurice Fallope was soon tested when, after seeing Geneviève sit in a chair, all 4 legs of the chair levitated from the ground before tossing her out of it. This event repeated itself 4 times, leaving no room for doubt that something unnatural was at play. Take the hint, Geneviève, you're probably sitting on the ghost. It's kinda rude. Despite trying to initially explain it away, like Mr. Billen and the priest before him, Constable Verloeb could no longer dismiss what he was seeing. The police suggested that Geneviève and her grandparents leave the house temporarily, hoping that the phenomena would subside, and they left for 36 hours. This isn't like a fumigation of a house, guys. Ghosts don't give up that easily. With that being said, it seemed like that they may have given up, as all activity in the house stopped while the Orchard family was away. When Mr. and Mrs. Orchard returned home on November 26th, everything was calm at first, but as is often the case in poltergeist hauntings, whatever was lurking in the shadows just needed the time to sap enough energy from its targeted victim. The pantry, which had been securely fastened, tipped over on its own, and a bucket overturned, spilling water across the floor. Just 2 hours later, Geneviève returned to the house, and as soon as she stepped through the door, a knife flew off the shelf and lodged itself under the table at lightning speed. Other objects, including a shoe and various tools, also flew through the air, further confirming that something supernatural was at play. And more disturbingly, it had selected Geneviève as its focus. Realising the seriousness of the situation, the police returned with a journalist to document the phenomena. As they investigated and listened to the chilling accounts from the Orchard family, a brush appeared to clean the chimney on its own. Hold on, don't be so hasty trying to get rid of this thing. Not many ghosts will do chores. I could get behind having a ghost if it doesn't mind walking our dogs. But then again, after picking up their poops, it'll be more than happy to go over to the spirit realm. Trust me. The violent activity was more prevalent and was escalating. It was clear that Genevieve's presence seemed to trigger the disturbances. The banging would go on all night, and the items being launched began to strike the elderly couple and their granddaughter. Physically and mentally wounded, the grandparents began to discuss sending Geneviève away to give them some peace. With the family falling apart, with concerns growing for the elderly couple's health, the gendarmes called in an expert in the paranormal, Captain Emile Tezane. Tezane, who was a respected officer in the Mail Brigade, had been investigating supernatural phenomena across France for over 20 years. Known for his skepticism, he approached the case with a clear analytical mind. This guy would have been best buds with Tony Cornell from my last video. He also came into a haunting with a skeptical approach, but ended up with more than he could bargain for. When Tezane arrived, he found the scene to be total chaos. While trying to learn the facts, he was disturbed by strange sounds and objects rattling off surfaces. He had investigated many hauntings throughout France, with none of them changing his mind, but after spending the night in the Orchard residence, he may have found the answers he had been looking for. During the night, Tezane began to experience some of the same disturbing phenomena reported by the family, the police and the priest. One terrifying moment that stood out to him was when he tried to help Geneviève and her grandparents pick up a chest of drawers that had been pushed over by the apparent spirit. While they were trying to lift it, an icy cold breeze suddenly swept through the room, which, as you know, can be a sign of the paranormal. Suddenly, a coffee grinder was thrown across the room with incredible force, landing several meters away. If that wasn't strange enough, a flower box then flew through the air so quickly that Tezane didn't have time to react. Everything he had witnessed appeared to defy logic. There was no natural reason for these things to move on their own, especially with such force. It was clear to Tezane that Geneviève was the target of the ghost, or the one responsible for an elaborate hoax. The thing is, if it was a hoax, he couldn't work out how she was doing it. He decided to put some control measures in place to try and determine the truth about the haunting. To do this, he needed to investigate with Geneviève alone. After emptying the house, he locked the door to make sure no one else could interfere with what they were trying to discover. In a calm but somewhat offhand way, Tezane remarked that no more damage would be tolerated in the house. Immediately after, like what seemed to be a direct message to his comment, a metal box flew across the room with such violence that it smashed into a lampshade. It was almost like the force behind these actions was listening and didn't take kindly to being told what to do. What made this haunting so chilling to Tazane was the way the paranormal activity seemed to not only follow a pattern, but also react to the people in the room. It wasn't just random, it felt like there was an awareness to this entity. The fact that Tazane's remark about no further damage being allowed led to an immediate targeted response from whatever entity was at work makes this case particularly unsettling. This spirit was intelligent. Tazane's investigation made it clear that this wasn't just a case of things being moved around or odd coincidences. There was something happening that couldn't be explained away by science or logic, whether it was a malevolent spirit, a manifestation of some kind of energy, or something else entirely. It was clear that the inhabitants of the Orchard House were dealing with something much more powerful than they could control. So why was Geneviève targeted? Well, it is believed that teens are at a stage in their life where everything feels intense, emotional and unpredictable, so it's no surprise that some stories suggest poltergeists are drawn to them. The theory goes that the chaotic energy surrounding teenagers, from hormones to the stress of figuring out who they are, creates a kind of emotional turbulence that spirits find easy to latch onto. These ghostly manifestations, such as moving objects, strange noises or eerie disturbances, are often linked to the unpredictable nature of adolescence itself. It's almost as if the poltergeist is just another thing in a teen's life that's hard to explain or control, like mood swings or sudden changes of interest. While they don't yet have the confidence and the mental strength, it leaves weaknesses for the entity to infiltrate their spirit and tap into their energy, like a cheeky neighbour trying to wire into your outdoor fuse box. While it's easy to dismiss it as just part of growing up, the idea still taps into that age-old fear of the unknown, especially when it feels like the supernatural is just one more thing to navigate, along with acne, cute boys, and TikTok trends. Despite his growing beliefs in the authenticity of the events, Tazane made a point of staying skeptical. This way, he would remain unbiased throughout the investigation. He considered the possibility that Geneviève could be intentionally causing the activity for attention, but he struggled to work out how she could have done the things he had witnessed. With the activity ceasing to slow down and the elderly Orchard couple at their wits' end, the police eventually stepped in and made the tragic decision to separate Geneviève from her grandparents to give them some peace. After forcing the teenager to leave her home, the activity immediately stopped and never was repeated. But for Geneviève, her story was far from over. After the strange events in Frontenay, Genevieve's life took a significant turn. Following the incident in 1943, she was sent to work as a cook at the home of a psychiatrist in Paris under the pretense of helping her recover from a psychological disorder. Her grandparents were thrilled that she could get some help, but unbeknownst to them, the psychiatrist's true motive wasn't just to get free roast dinners cooked for him, but to study Geneviève further, perhaps with the intent of understanding her behaviour, was part of some alternative motive. As time passed, the psychiatrist encouraged Geneviève to confess that she had faked the supernatural events. In early December 1943, she officially told the police that all the occurrences at her grandparents' house, both in May and November, were fabricated by herself. She claimed that she had faked the acts as pranks and had done them intentionally. Her statement seemed to resolve the case for the authorities, and the media immediately jumped on the idea that the whole affair had been a hoax. In fact, the press had a field day with the story, quickly turning it into a mockery of the police officers who witnessed what they called supernatural events. Rumours started flying that Geneviève had been buying up books on the occult, suggesting that these strange happenings were just a result of her troubled mind and extensive research. Some even whisper about a shady figure, a man with a bad reputation, who supposedly sold her these books and might have been behind the furniture breaking stunts, possibly using tricks by weakening furniture and attaching fishing rod wire. So you're telling me she bumped into some shady bloke on the street, he opened up his trench coat with a load of occult books in the pocket. I wonder if he gave her the first one for free to get her hooked. That's how I started. Meanwhile, the officers who had seen the bizarre occurrences firsthand didn't buy the idea of a hoax. They knew what they had witnessed, but their superiors had decided to close the case, ordering them to stay quiet. Which they did. As for Captain Tazane, the late confession didn't sway his view at all. He found the whole thing too convenient and suspected that the young girl's statement had been influenced, possibly forced, by the psychiatrist who wanted to be the one to crack the curious case that had attracted so much public attention. After the haunting in Frontenay and the negative attention the case garnered, Geneviève was sent to London for medical treatment and to escape the overwhelming publicity surrounding the event. She was experiencing a lot of stress and emotional turmoil, and her grandparents believed that a change of environment might help her. Genevieve's time in London was part of her recovery process, and the activity never repeated. So it seems pretty cut and dry. Geneviève was a troubled young girl looking for attention, which went too far. That explanation would have been a good one for the police, who were left red-faced, but Geneviève later put a spanner in the works as she retracted her confession later on. In a new statement, she explained that the psychiatrist had manipulated her into saying the things he wanted to hear and that she found the man intimidating. She apologised for lying in her first statement and said that she wasn't responsible for the haunting and wouldn't have known where to start even if she wanted to. She also said that she didn't want to go back to her grandparents' home as she knew that the poltergeist would be waiting for her. Beyond the documented account of the haunting, little is known about Genevieve's life afterward. The case seemed to have affected her deeply, and she reportedly lived a quiet life afterward out of the public eye. The case remains a curious chapter in French paranormal history, with many still debating whether Geneviève was truly behind the events or something paranormal was at play. In 1977, Captain Émile Tazan wrote a book titled Le Mystère de Maison Hantée, where he revisited the events of Frontenay. In the book, he shared his belief that the phenomena could not all be chalked down to trickery, although he didn't completely dismiss the possibility that Geneviève was involved in some way. This story has a lot of parallels with other cases I've covered on my channel, like the Amherst mystery or the Battersea poltergeist, where a teenage girl is seemingly targeted by a malevolent spirit. In those cases, the girls were also accused of faking phenomenon for attention. Well, that would be an easy answer. There's always experiences in these cases that people struggle to explain, and more importantly, struggle to explain how the girls were supposed to have pulled them off. Maybe poo-pooing the whole thing as a hoax is a way to protect themselves from the horrifying prospect that paranormal entities can share or infiltrate our plane of reality. They do say ignorance is bliss. The events in Frontenay remain as one of those classic hauntings that continue to baffle investigators and anyone interested in the paranormal. The sheer physicality of the manifestations, with objects being hurled through the air with no obvious cause, along with the fact that they seem to react to specific human behaviour, makes this case an interesting one. It serves as a reminder that there are still mysteries in this world that can't be easily explained, no matter how hard we try and make sense of them. If you enjoyed this video, please support me and the channel by subscribing, hitting the notification bell, giving the video a thumbs up and leaving a comment about your thoughts on the case. Or just leave me a comment about what you're having for dinner or what animal you think could beat up a ninja robot. It all helps. And until next time, sleep well, friends.